Well, good morning, everyone, and greetings from Washington, D.C. To those of you joining us from Asia and India, good evening. And if there are others joining us from other parts of the world, greetings, welcome. I'm delighted to host this book discussion this morning with three wonderful colleagues and friends. We are going to be discussing Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam's second volume in his Military History of India, this one titled A Military History of India Since 1972, and covering roughly the last 50 years of political life. Arjun's book covers a whole range of military operations, from operations that involve high combat to operations that involve humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, to smaller scale operations, which demonstrate both the flexibility of India's armed forces and oftentimes its considerable ingenuity. Arjun is with us this morning. He holds the President's Chair of Excellence in National Security at the National Defense College in New Delhi. He was a decorated pilot and a serving officer in the Indian Air Force, retired as an Air Vice Marshal after having brought to conclusion successfully the Indian Air Force's doctrine, which was published in 2012. So welcome, Arjun. It's great to have you back with us, I should say, at Carnegie, since you have made an appearance before. Joining Arjun today are two dear friends and great scholars of South Asia, and I will start with Chris Fair, who is a professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University's Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service. She was also previously my colleague at RAND, I'm proud to say, and is the author in her own right of a great book on South Asian security, which focused on the Pakistan Army and its way of war. She's also done extraordinary work looking at issues of terrorism and insurgency in South Asia, and also has a cookbook from the world's, shall we say, most interesting states. So welcome, Chris. It's good to have you back here. And last but not least, of course, is Colonel Jack Gill, who is an associate professor at the NISA Center, which is a DoD-supported think tank that focuses on the Near East and South Asia at National Defense University. Jack has had a long and storied career in the U.S. Army. He was an armor officer to begin with, eventually ended up in the intelligence services, was the defense intelligence officer for South Asia, actually, for many years. By training, a foreign area officer as well. Served as an assistant to the director for plans and policy on the Joint Staff, served in Islamabad. And in addition to the work that he has done actually on South Asian military issues, is one of the country's most distinguished historians of Napoleon and the Napoleonic era. So we have a wonderful panel here this morning to discuss Arjun's book. I have asked Arjun to speak for about 10 minutes or so, laying out the broad themes of the second volume. And then I will invite Chris and Jack to join us in offering their own thoughts, after which we will have a conversation and open the discussion to the floor. So without further ado, welcome to all of you. Welcome to all our listeners. And over to you, Arjun. You have the virtual floor.
Well, thank you, Ashley, for that very gracious and kind introduction. And thank you to Carnegie for hosting this discussion. Exactly 4 years after they hosted the discussion revolving around my first book. And I'm also delighted to have as co-discussants Christine and Jack. And it would be interesting that both of them were involved in discussing my first book too. Christine at Georgetown and Jack as a discussant with Ashley at Carnegie. So it's nice to have old friends back discussing something of extremely important consequence as India forges ahead in different dimensions towards its aspirational objective of being a power of consequence in the years ahead. Now, I'm not going to talk so much about my book and the chapters and what all it covers, because I would hope that many of you will go ahead and grab a copy and read the book. What I'm instead going to do is I'm going to touch upon 4 themes that have acted as both drivers and motivators for me to write this 2-volume series that has stretched across 9 years. And the 4 themes that I'm going to look at is, the first one is, where does military history stand in the overall landscape of contemporary Indian historical discourse in the post-independence era? The second theme that I'm going to address is about democracy and India. How significant have the armed forces been in where Indian democracy is today, a vibrant and a flourishing democracy? The third issue that I'm going to touch upon is this whole issue of full spectrum operations and the changing character of war and conflict. There is a misplaced perception that because India's armed forces have been largely trained for conventional operations and equipped for conventional operations, their response to the full spectrum of operations has been less than nimble. But I will argue throughout my book that India's armed forces have demonstrated an elasticity and flexibility that I think very few armed forces across the world have demonstrated. And I recollect several scholars and retired military officers questioning me. So you're writing after 1972? There's not too much of conflict after 1972. It's only Kargil 1999. And then as I started writing, it's over 400 pages. And the conflict spectrum that I've written about stretches across the spectrum of conflict. And I think when one looks at how India's armed forces have plugged fissures and cracks and protected sovereignty and geographical frontiers, I think its contribution to democracy and its adaptability to the changing character of war has been fairly significant. There have been hiccups, but I mean to say, which large armed forces in the world have not had hiccups? I mean, even the most powerful military in the world has had hiccups, galore in the post-World War II era. The fourth theme that is very, very dear to me, in fact, it is the dearest theme and has been the principal motivator for both these books, has been this issue of jointness and synergy. And what pleases me the most in both these books is that I have been able to tell stories and narrate in fair amount of depth and sequence exploits of India's army, the navy, and the air force. And I've shed my uniform, I've shed my blue uniform and got into the skin of the army and the navy and attempted to tell their story. And that for me is the greatest satisfaction that I have. And coming as it does at a time when India has embarked on a series of transformation and attempting to beef up integration and synergy, I think this is a small contribution to that endeavor in India's armed forces to understand one another. So let me start with the first, military history. Military history has been an understudied and under-acknowledged element of contemporary Indian historical discourse for the pure and simple reason that it was seen as a forgettable legacy of our colonial past. And as a result, military history was always pushed to the sidelines. And instead, you have political, social, economic, environmental, and cultural historians assuming pole position while describing India's contemporary historical legacy in the post-independence era. And I think that I think it was very unfair. And so I think that's one principal driver that I had while writing both these books. The second issue is of democracies. Now, have you ever thought that as against the aspirations of India's founding fathers, that India would chart this brave new course in democracy in the post-World War II era? If you look at the list of conflicts that India has engaged in since independence, India is a warring democracy. And in a warring democracy, if a warring democracy has to survive, its armed forces have to play a critical role in the survival of that democracy. So that's another very understudied and a very under-acknowledged aspect of India's armed forces, that it has been a critical element of Indian democracy. So I come to the changing character of war and conflict. Now, and I talked about, and you will see throughout the book, I highlight the elasticity of Indian military thought, despite being rooted in relatively colonial and conventional military mindset. And I think that to a large extent has happened because it's not only senior leadership within the Indian military, but it's also junior leadership at the squadron, at the battalion, and at the ship level that has contributed immensely to adaptability of India's armed forces. And you see that in counterinsurgency operations, you see that in Sri Lanka, you see that in Kargil, wherein junior and middle level leadership have pitched in weightily when it comes to India's military response. Now, let's look at the expanded spectrum of conflict. In my book, I talk about counterinsurgency operations of different flavors, whether it is in the Northeast or whether it is in Jammu and Kashmir. I talk about semi-urban operations. I talk about high intensity but limited conflict in Kargil. I talk about India's growing desire and aspiration to expand its influence and employ its military as one of those instruments. And I'm talking about Sri Lanka, I'm talking about Maldives, I'm talking about India's stellar contribution in UN peacekeeping operations. So there is this element of the military being employed as an instrument of statecraft as India's influence in its neighborhood and globally has increased. Then I talk about, and actually a large portion of my book describes 24/7 and 365 days operations along the line of actual control and line of control, face-offs, skirmishes, and encounters. Now, for the common citizen or for the common student of contemporary Indian military history, those are isolated piecemeal incidents. But when you put them together as a mosaic, it truly reflects the expanded spectrum of conflict. It includes the gray zone that we are talking about today. It includes operations other than war, and it includes something that we are all very familiar with today, and that is all measures short of war. So, this is an armed forces that has evolved. Yes, there have been several hiccups. It has been slow to evolve and modernize like any other large military force. There have been issues of civil-military relations. There have been issues of lack of synergy. But then, after all, this is all a process of evolving. And rather than being excessively critical, I have actually been fairly analytical in examining where all issues need improvement. Now, the last issue that I'm going to touch upon is this whole issue of jointness. Now, I've examined the entire landscape of contemporary military history that's been written worldwide. And one thing that gives me immense pleasure is that very few practitioners across the globe have attempted to don multiple hats while simultaneously talking about operations of all the three services. And the joint flavor or the concurrently joint narrative that I put together in the book gives me immense satisfaction, because I think that is something that a larger number of military officers, not only in India, but across the world, need to imbibe as they grasp with more than just war when it comes to recent genres of warfare. There is immense necessity to understand not only their fellow warfighters in different uniforms, but other disciplines of statecraft too. And I think that too comes across pretty clearly in my book, particularly when I'm dealing with situations less than war, particularly the several episodes that I've written about when it comes to the face-offs along the line of actual control, whether it is Nathula or whether it is 1986, 87 at Sundarangchu, a close, I've tried to bring to life interaction between politicians, between generals, between subordinate commanders, and tried to weave it all together into a comprehensive narrative that fits the name, which is full spectrum. Full spectrum. When I talk in the book about full spectrum operations, I'm also directing my narrative at a full spectrum readership. And I hope it's not just the military or policy makers who will read the book, but it is anybody who wants to know a little more about India's armed forces who will pick up the book and leaf through. So with that, I think we have in the Air Force something known as, and particularly as a fighter pilot, as a time over target. I think actually I've stuck to my time over target, and now I think it's over to Christine to take on from here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Arjun. That was actually great. This is a difficult book to summarize because it is obviously a history. And as you point out, a joint history, which is best read and enjoyed as opposed to sort of narrated. And so I'm glad you took the time to flag the critical themes. And I'm sure we'll come back in the discussion to at least two of the four themes that you laid out. So, Chris, why don't I yield the floor to you and ask you to give us your comments, please? Thank you.
Okay, I will. But first, thank you for that very nice introduction. I'm actually really grateful to be on this panel because Ashley and Jack are some of my dearest mentors. I think now we can say that we've been slogging it out for like 2+ decades. And under your tutelage, I got all of these gray hairs. So which Ashley pointed out a few years ago, he says, your hair is all gray. I'm like, yeah, studying Pakistan, it has that effect upon you. So the book is very, and so I'm not, as Ashley knows, because I was his RA for a long time, I am not I am not a forest person. I'm a tree person. I feel much more comfortable looking at trees, studying the bark. And I am terrible at abstracting to the forest because I feel uncomfortable describing the forest if I don't know the tree. So rather than, as I think you did a really nice job laying out your book and what its strengths is, right? You just do yeoman's work and laying out in incredible detail the different kinds of operations that not only India's traditional armed forces, but also the paramilitary and police forces have engaged in. And it was really nice, actually, how you brought those civilian forces and the quasi-civilian military forces to bear. So, so in the interest of time, I just want to hone in on one piece of your book. So in my South Asia class, and at the end of the day, I kind of want to challenge you as a historian, right? So as I'm reading this, the biggest, I won't say competitor, but obviously Srinath Raghavan is a really important military historian. And as I was asking myself, would I be able to use this book in my class? And the problem that I have is that as you situate yourself as a historian, I think historians, because you are situating yourself as a historian, you said, I've shed my uniform, I'm engaging in this space. One of the things that I think historians do empirically is that they present evidence for both sides of the argument. And then they explain, on balance, what do I think is the best interpretation of events and why? And so historians bring to that narration a point of view which is empirically buttressed after doing due diligence to different kinds of evidence. And so I wanted to really focus on the Balakot discussion. In my class, we spent a lot of time on Balakot for a variety of reasons. I think it speaks to civil military issues. It speaks to how the military itself has become politicized in a way that I think a lot of Indians are not really accustomed to. And you see this in the political culture, like war movies have really stepped up their game. As you know from that fabulous book that you suggested to me, Bollywood Goes to War. But you also see it in the TV serials. Spycraft is being normalized. Things that used to be said about Balochistan a handful of years ago are being normalized through Indian serials, right? Indians are becoming comfortable in their military skin, right? But that's why the Balakot discussion really discomforted me in a lot of ways. So, for example, you simply say outright that India shot down an F-16. Well, hasn't been any credible evidence to suggest that actually did happen. And I think as a historian, it's incumbent upon you to say the evidence for this is mixed. Indian sources say XYZ, and then to break down that evidence and to think critically upon it. So you are an aviator. You know that the radar pictures that were presented to us do not tell the story. And when I saw the air chief present these data, it really reminded me of Colin Powell at the UN presenting his interpretation or someone else's interpretation of aerial photography of what Iraq was or wasn't doing, things that he absolutely knew to be untrue based upon his experience. And so as a historian, I found that evidence-free assertion to be problematic, and I'm going to explain why in a minute. I think the most important part of the discussion on Balakot, you completely elided the countervailing evidence of the extent of the destruction, and you simply brushed it aside, which is what India did, right? But I think the most important thing is that India demonstrated when we have the will, we're going to drop ordnance on Pakistan when we need to. That's the takeaway story. But if you simply focus on that really top-level story, you really miss this civil-military interaction where the Indian public is being told it has a capability. And when the next crisis happens, there's going to be a further expectation of something even more shabash and shandar than that, right? So educating the public about what really happened, I think is really important. As someone who lived through 4 years of the Trump administration and being told things like, for example, the whole narrative of how al-Baghdadi died when we had no way of seeing what was in that tunnel was really damaging, I think, for civil-military relations. At another level, the Balakot discussion, not just you, but the Indian narrative that has become ossifying fact when it's really not supported by fact, is that had the Dusra Banda, if you listen to the whole ISPR talk about the Dusra Banda, and I've transcribed the whole talk from the Urdu, I listened to the whole dang thing. In that speech, there are no few, I would say about 70% of that press conference was bakwas. Outright bakwas. And that which was not bakwas was braggadocio. And yet the entire Indian story about shooting down the F-16 lies upon the Dusra Banda. And so in my class, I talk a lot about, because we've got kids going into our intelligence community, the analytical community. This is an exact case of confirmation bias, right? No one in India would ever say that the ISPR is a gem of truth-telling. Right. But they honed in on this one thing from a whole, samundar of bakwas. And that's what they hang the story on. And my fear that this has become the story of Balakot is that I asked the counterfactual. Had Ghaffur not made the guffaw of the Dusra Banda, what would have been the escalatory off-ramp, right? Because the story of the F-16 allowed both sides to say, I've had my pound of gosht. Now we can de-escalate. Our polities are satisfied. But had the Dusra Banda story not emerged, how would have this de-escalated? And so this is sort of like my critique of this history telling, is that it does a disservice to actually the role of deception and disinformation in how this conflict de-escalated. So I hope I didn't go over, but I wanted to push you on that because I think as a historian, you have a responsibility to all of the information that's available to you. And as you know, we're going to do a follow-up podcast because I want to know about your research methods, how you form the question and so forth. So I'll get a chance to hear more from you about that, but thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was great because one of the issues that I hope we will discuss, after Jack speaks is the larger question of, military history in India. And I think Arjun flagged accurately that this is not a discipline that has been taken seriously, even though India, and I love that phrase, a warring democracy, right? For a country where conflict has been endemic since its birth and persists to this day, I want to raise some questions about why it is so hard to do military history in India. So we'll come back to this. So thank you for flagging that. Jack, let me bring you into this conversation. Go ahead, please.
Thanks very much, Ashley. It's great to be back here, especially with Arjun and having participated in your launch here in the States 4 years ago. Always good to be with Carnegie, albeit virtually in this case, so thanks for the opportunity. I should note that although I am no longer a US government employee, I have been in the past, but everything I have to say is my own invention, to quote Lewis Carroll, and has nothing to do with US policy, doesn't represent any official positions, that sort of thing. So let me start by congratulating Arjun on the fine new book that nicely fills a niche in Indian modern military history. And a lot of things to like about the book, and I hope we'll get to talk about some of those in the Q&A. And I'm very keen on the whole notion of military history in India and Pakistan and the rest of the world. So I appreciate your point number one. So with the book as a starting point, Ashley asked me to address a couple of specific issues. So I'll provide some thoughts on those that will echo, I think, some of the themes that Arjun raised in his remarks. The first is an assessment of India's capacity to respond to military challenges. And in my view, India's record, like that of most countries, is mixed. As far as conventional warfare is concerned, with the glaring exception of '62 and the Sino-Indian border war, India has won or achieved some kind of an acceptable stalemate in all of its conventional conflicts, including Kargil in 1999. It's also preserved its territorial integrity, as Arjun mentioned, and its perceptions, at least, of its borders, especially vis-a-vis China, at least up till 2014. Now, there's a debate in India about what happened in Doklam in 2017 and the events last year, but that's partly political as well as military. And the Indian military, specifically the army, has a great deal of experience in counterinsurgency. There are always questions of human rights abuses in such cases. India is no exception, but there are also a lot of examples in India of the military exerting itself to address local people's needs and grievances with civic work projects and other needs. And the army would claim, at least, that in several instances it's done about all that it can do on the security front, but that the civilian authorities have failed to take advantage of military success with political remedies. And I think there's a fairly persuasive case to be made for these assertions. In India's case, of course, as Chris just highlighted, counterinsurgency is intimately associated with cross-border retaliations. And these include the so-called surgical strikes in 2016, periodic so-called fire assaults across the line of control in Kashmir, and most recently, the Balakot in 2019. Opacity and contradictory claims make it very difficult to judge how effective these actions have been. And we must ask if the intended political message was credible if the operations were not militarily successful, or if they appeared unsuccessful to the larger public. And Chris talked about this in considerable detail. But regardless of the degree of success, I think it's clear that there's a high level of risk involved. As far as other challenges, I don't want to take too much time, but we do need to note India's longstanding reputation as a reliable member of UN operations and having done well in humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, both at home and abroad. The second question I was asked to talk about was India's capacity to innovate. And I agree with Arjun in his use of the term elasticity, which is a great phrase, by the way. But I would talk about a differentiation between innovation and improvisation. To me, India has repeatedly demonstrated considerable ability and imagination when it comes to improvisation, but it's consistently encountered problems with innovation. Though it's not part of Arjun's most recent book, see his previous work, the Indian military showed successful improvisation repeatedly in 1971, demonstrated similar skills in 1999 in Kargil and elsewhere. Innovation, on the other hand, as I see it, has been less successful if we think about bringing new equipment into the services. The Arjun tank and the Tejas light combat aircraft stand out as prime examples. And likewise regarding new doctrine and force structure. It's too soon to tell whether the so-called integrated battle groups really function. Certainly the Army says, yes, we proved it, we did this exercise, everything's great, but there's reason to be skeptical, I think. Moreover, much of the improvisation and innovation seems to be quite ad hoc. That is to say, it's not institutionalized, but it's reliant on having an imaginative individual in one place or another at one time or another. So to me, again, that's considerable risk. Finally, let me turn to principal military challenges India has to address in the future. In the broadest terms, it has to adapt to new challenges while attempting to cope with the old ones. Indeed, in some respects, the old ones not only persist, but they become harder in the information age in which we all live. In other words, the new is additive to the old, and India has to address both. These traditional or persistent challenges include conventional warfare with China and Pakistan, as Arjun has talked about, that covers everything from skirmishes on remote mountaintops that no one can find on Google Earth to full-scale war. And these traditional missions, in my view, are complicated greatly by India's need to undertake a truly massive military modernization program in coming years, already overdue. On the internal security front, that's another persistent challenge. The Indian government has other hard tools to employ and doesn't have to automatically turn to the army, and does not always turn to the army. And it could reduce, with political means, the overall domestic threat. But regular troops, overwhelmingly the army, will be involved heavily for the foreseeable future. There's also a standing nuclear requirement to craft if we go to the exact opposite end of the spectrum, craft a force that reinforces credible deterrence without absorbing the whole defense budget, and keeps technological determinism in check, and balances offense and defense without succumbing to arms race compulsions. We can add some new challenges to these persistent ones. These include retaliation against terrorism, not new per se, but the Indian government has demonstrated that it will turn to military action to react to terror attacks from other countries, specifically Pakistan. And it's hard to imagine that any future government, not the BJP Modi government, that any future one will resile from this approach. This implies a crucial interaction of hardware, organization, command and control, especially intelligence, and, as Chris and Ashley pointed out, the military political intersection, with an eye to public perceptions home and abroad. On the more conventional side, there's a growing need to project security into the Indian Ocean. At a minimum, this raises questions about jointness, Navy and Air Force in particular, but it also implies political tasks for coordination with regional states and with outside powers. Closely linked to the Indian Ocean security question is that of deployable or expeditionary capabilities, that is, beyond United Nations operations. And I'm in strong agreement with Ashley, where he's written that India needs to be able to deploy at least some subset of world-class military formations with significant reach and endurance. To paraphrase, I don't have the footnote, Ashley, but we can supply that later. This applies to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, of course, and non-combatant evacuation, as we've seen in 2015, for example, as well as combat operations. And as with Indian Ocean security, these missions impose serious demands on jointness across all services, as well as political demands for coordination with outside powers in almost any contingency, be that hostile or benign. And there are a whole bunch of other challenges one could talk about, but let me conclude by stressing again the importance of the three intersections that I've mentioned already. One is that intersection among the three Indian services. It may be a particularly American or Western perspective, but I strongly agree with Arjun that this question of jointness, as we would say, or jointmanship, as would be said in South Asia, seems crucial to meeting the challenges of right now, as well as those of the future. Second is the civil-military intersection, a continuous informed dialogue in a democracy. It's absolutely vital. But as I would agree with Anit Mukherjee's conclusion that at the moment that civil-military dialogue is largely absent. The third is the intersection with other countries in a mutually beneficial partnership. And that would be arguably essential. Again, this is paraphrasing Ashley, I'm afraid, arguably essential for India to achieve its own security goals. So with those very brief remarks, I hope we can turn things back to Ashley and some discussion.
Thank you, Jack. That was fabulous. I mean, both Chris and you, I think, laid out a huge menu of issues. I want to start with one that is anchored in Chris's question or complaint, but I want to broaden the discussion because I think this is a serious challenge as India begins to think of its place in the world, right? George Santayana had this wonderful line that those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it. And that, of course, presumes that we know what our history is to begin with, right? And Arjun flagged this by talking about the absence of military history as a serious discipline. So the question I have for you, Arjun, and also for Jack and Chris, is how does one do military history in a country where information is so tightly controlled, where many decades after conflicts have concluded, the official histories of these conflicts are not released. And so someone like you who's attempting to do, genuinely a joint history, right, is then compelled to fall back on the memories of people who were involved in events 50 years ago. And of course, there are fragmentary pieces of information. The regimental histories, thankfully, are still quite decent. But when you think of particularly the political military interface, that's not something you find in a regimental history. How do you do that? how do you do serious military history in India today? And is there reason to believe that, there's any room for hope here? Or are we condemned to literally live from myth to myth, as Chris pointed out, has become commonplace? And I ask this now against the backdrop of some larger trends in Indian politics today, right? Where it's not just military history, but there are serious efforts to reinterpret India's history writ large, which makes it even more important that one speak to the questions of the evidentiary base and the methodological training. I mean, are there enough people out there who have the skills and the interest in doing this? So give us some sense of what the challenges you faced were as you were pulling together, the record in the book.
Ashley, one of the reasons why, or one of the ways in tackling this conundrum that you've highlighted, is the reason why I call both my narratives as hybrid narratives. I do not claim to be a classical historian. Rather, I'm a practitioner who is attempting to straddle the intersection between a practitioner's perspective and a historian or an academic's endeavor to arrive at the most probable hypothesis or the most probable event that took place. Now, all the challenges that you mentioned were the ones that I faced. I mean, say there is an absence of archival information, particularly in the post-1972 era. I didn't have that problem much before 1971 because there is adequate archival information before 1971. But there is a complete absence of archival information after 1972. And you're right, regimental diaries and squadron histories are pretty robust sources of primary information, but they are not robust enough to satisfy somebody like Chris. But it satisfies me as a hybrid narrator of events. Now, you talked about memories of veterans. Now, veterans constituted a large segment of my primary sources of information. And I was indeed fortunate because I was part of the armed forces, my access to veterans and the openness with which they came out with their experiences, I think convinced me that if I were to manage adequate amount of triangulation, I should arrive at the most probable course of events. So if there was something controversial about Kargil, I would speak to 3 or 4 people who were involved in the same theater or in the same battle. And then if there was convergence, I knew that this is where I need to zero in, or this is what actually happened. Now, working back on Chris, obviously, because I was a serving officer for my first book and just recently retired for my second book, I didn't have access to Chinese or Pakistani official sources. So that's something that I had to live with. And I remember a conversation I had with Lawrence Friedman in Oxford, when I mentioned to him that these were the issues that troubled me about was I going to be able to come out with something really authentic. He says, don't worry too much about authenticity. Just do the best you can to speak to the maximum people you can, and then make your own analysis. And that's where I come back to Chris's observation. She has her strong opinion on Balakot. But what I would like to add is that Balakot was just a drop in the ocean for me as far as the entire landscape of war and conflict. So obviously, I had to limit my amount of time that I could spend on Balakot. And therefore, when I looked at Balakot, I had to ask myself, look, do I get into the tactical and operational dimensions, or do I look at the big picture? And therefore, I settled for the big picture because strategically, India was attempting a significant shift from reactive deterrence to a certain amount of coercive deterrence and a certain amount of experimentation with coercive signaling. So if you look at coercive deterrence and if you look at coercive signaling, so I think both Uri, Balakot, as well as Doklam sent a message to an adversary that, look, India is attempting a shift. The shift will be slow, but it is attempting a shift nevertheless. And therefore, I urge readers to look at Doklam, Balakot, Uri from that perspective and not at the micro tactical perspectives that are hindered by the absence of authentic archival information that is available to exactly say what happened on the ground. So yes, there were immense challenges, and I had to make the best use of available resources in order to arrive at a most probable hypothesis.
So I want to bring Jack Gill in on this, because one of the discussions that Jack and I have had over the years, is the challenges for writing military history, particularly in the subcontinent, with all the constraints that we are very familiar with, including, some things that look small, but actually I think sort of betray the bigger problem. And that is the absence of decent maps, while discussing military history, where, the scales are out of whack. Events are not exactly located because someone has, an obsession with secrecy and preventing, this information from being disseminated and things like that. But Jack, you've attempted to write, if not books, certainly, quite detailed chapters of various military episodes. I mean, what is your take on, on what Arjun has just said on this issue?
Well, I would start, Ashley, by one, agreeing with you. And as you well know, and I'll self-promote here, I suppose, one of the reasons I undertook the Atlas of the 1971 war was that the people talked about it who didn't know anything. And so I did the best I could with what was available, but it was enormously frustrating to read repeatedly Indian histories or memoirs of generals and such. And there would be little maps in there. First off, 2/3 of the places that were mentioned were never on a map in the first place. But secondly, all of the maps said not to scale, or they would just have a name of something and no dot or no mountain. It is enormously difficult to make any sense out of such narratives, particularly along the line of control, where everyone assumes that, oh yes, well, when I say ring contour, everyone knows where ring contour is. Okay, well, ring contour, how many could there be along a 700-kilometer line of control that's heavily mountainous? Probably more than one. So one, I would agree with you on that kind of tactical detail. And secondly, I agree with you on if you will, a strategic or a meta problem, which is the lack of archives, the reliance on memoir literature or interviews with people, and the whole Sir Henry V remembering with advantages problem, or just forgetting and thinking and you've forgotten something. But on the larger scale, this reinterpretation of Indian history. And if we look at the military side, in my sense, and this would be a good study for someone doing their master's thesis or a doctoral thesis. But it seems to me in a large scale that India has changed from somewhat more realistic military history in the past to, in maybe the most recent 5 years or 10 years, to a more triumphalist reinterpretation. If we look at how 1965 was not just commemorated, but celebrated most recently on its anniversary, this is a different way of looking at history from the military perspective in India as compared to the past, where it's used for more political purposes. So we're going to tell ourselves this story. It doesn't matter if anyone else believes it or if it's even true. Parts of it are, but we're going to tell ourselves this story for political purposes. Whereas to me, it's absolutely crucial that we understand the past in a realistic fashion. The United States is not always great at this, but when at the U.S. Army Staff College, one of the things you study is that disaster in Iran trying to rescue the hostages, because there's so much to learn from the absolute disaster. And so we went into that in great detail and declassified documents and that sort of thing that people could use to understand what went wrong and why we don't want to do that anymore. And I on the Balakot thing, I have to comment that it's okay if India believes one thing, but if nobody outside of India believes that, or if there are questions, then one has to ask, well, did India achieve what it wanted to achieve if the outside world thinks, wow, we're not really sure what happened there, or nothing happened there, or, so that kind of level of detail can be important. Thanks.
Sure.
Actually, can I make a comment? Yeah.
Yes, please, please go ahead.
I think Anit Mukherjee also has talked about this in considerable detail about how difficult it is to do this kind of work. And he basically had to do what Arjun did, right? Which was leverage his service. And it was really just personal networking. Now, this always produces bias, right? Because there's a whole bunch of people that you didn't know who didn't want to talk to you, right? Because they had different opinions or they wanted to engage in sort of satisfying the interviewer, right? All of us encounter this. But, you know, even in the United States, I really caution my students from looking at declassified information without understanding the universe sample problem, right? When stuff is declassified, we don't know how representative it is of the whole universe of information about this. And I think about Scott Sagan's poor article on why some countries keep nuclear weapons and some develop them, some give them up. And his entire Indian case study, which argued that it was not India did not pursue nuclear weapons for security reasons, hinged upon the fact that India, according to him, didn't ever seek nuclear guarantees. About 3 years after he wrote the article, you know, the test happened, and all of a sudden, oh, guess what? India did in fact seek guarantees. So if we don't approach even the body of declassified information with the humble wisdom of a statistician asking how representative is the sample, we will still go wrong. And so even people who work on American history, I think they have a false sense of surety, right? That we are open when we don't even know that. And WikiLeaks has compromised us even more. As people rely upon WikiLeaks, I say, oh, no. This is the worst kind of sample bias. Because if there was if there was some CIA analyst who was just really angry at how the drone program got a bum deal, and they sent to Glenn Greenwald a tranche of exculpatory documents, would we see that on The Intercept? No, we would not. Would that have been something that Snowden would have released that would have then become available to WikiLeaks? No, right? Because WikiLeaks is a project of anti-Americanism, right? Of Russian spycraft. And I see too many people mistaking those as an unbiased source of data when it's biased, you know, shrews, right? So I think all of us that work in the space, I think we have to be really humble about what we have. I mean, what we have a lot of in South Asia is historiographies, right? And I think that's that might be Arjun has essentially done this, right? He's like, I've done the best I can with these data. But as long as one caveats that, right? I think every book that attempts to deal with these issues should have a whole data section. Like, tell us what you think about your data. And that allows a reader to judge, you know, how we should tread upon these narratives and the data upon which they're based.
So I have a question for Arjun, which comes from the audience. So Pratik Datta mentions that there's a new rule that would prevent retired Indian bureaucrats from disclosing information to security. I presume this is by not writing, shall we say, fully truthful memoirs or what have you. So the question he asks is, you know, how will this impact military research? And how do other countries address this problem of balancing the need for confidentiality with the need for open analysis? Go ahead, Arjun.
You know, I think that's a very simple question to answer. Wherever you are, whether you're in the United States or whether you're in India or whether you're in any other, even a flourishing and a liberal democracy, there will always be a balance that would have to be drawn between confidentiality and coming out with the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And I think practitioners will always have that challenge, that how to straddle a line that offers adequate credibility and at the same time protects confidentiality. And that was something that was absolutely applicable to the work that I've done. You know, that is why I mention in both my books that my book is not for the classic academic who is looking at data sets or who's looking at hardcore evidence. It is a best possible methodology to take military history, India's armed forces, tactics, operations, and strategy to a wide cross-section of readers, which includes even students, 15 and 16-year-olds who are interested in military history. Now, I asked many of my readers, the issue that Chris brought out about my book doesn't have much of data. It doesn't have tables. It doesn't have graphs. It doesn't have charts. It has maps that have been simplified to cater to a wide audience. And when we're talking about maps, Jack, your maps from 1971 were actually the inspiration for my maps in my book, and I've acknowledged that. And the second is that your chapter on Kargil in Peter Lavoie's edited volume has fabulous maps. Your estimation of disposition of units on both sides, on the Pakistani side and on the Indian side, are as accurate as could be at that particular time. And I've drawn heavily on that. For example, Christine, your work on the Lashkar-e-Toiba have formed the basis of my understanding of the Lashkar. But that has not been my only understanding of the Lashkar. Having listened or having absorbed what you've written about the Lashkar-e-Toiba, for me, as important was to speak to that Special Forces battalion commander in the early 1990s who engaged in encounters with the Lashkar and told me what fierce fighters they were, and I mean to say how they changed the dimension in Jammu and Kashmir. So I think the answer to that question is you have to, as a practitioner, you have to draw a very balanced and nuanced line when it comes to deciding on how much of confidentiality do you want to breach without compromising on the authenticity.
I would offer one other thought in terms of, I agree with everything you've said, but I think institutional change makes a difference. And so, for example, if you have a rule that stipulates that all documents have to be declassified by a certain date, right?
25 years.
Exactly. I think that goes a long way. I mean, and there's a way to protect information that is, sensitive even 35 or 50 years out.
Yeah.
But if that rule is actually upheld both in spirit and in practice, I mean, it allows people to get information that would otherwise, be contained. The second, of course, is simply cultural, right? The more people that write, the greater the diversity of perspectives. And I think this is where India in some ways falls short, with the number of people who, for whatever reason, feel diffident about putting pen to paper and, sort of telling their story. It just means that the evidentiary base becomes thinner. So those are things that hopefully, will change in time. There's a question that has come again from Pratik, and I want to ask it in a slightly different way, which is, he has said, given the sort of political temptations for fudging and data manipulation and so on and so forth, which exist in every society, but I think, in the context of our India discussion, what are the risks this imposes for developing a world-class Indian military? In other words, can you weaken yourself by, in a sense, not telling the truth corporately or collectively, to the military officers who you are training and preparing?
Ashley, this is one thing we've been, I must tell you that in my current position, we discuss a lot of issues on telling truth to power. And one of the positive spin-offs of telling truth to power is that it aids in capability development. It allows policymakers, it allows the strategic establishment to exactly know where they are. Now the point is that telling truth to power need not always be tom-tom to the rest of the world that this is what we're telling the powers to be. And so to suggest that all data is fudged in India, and to suggest that the right information flow does not take place, both above, from top to bottom and from bottom to top, is not really the entire story. We can do much better. we need senior leadership to be more candid when it comes to expressing fault lines and expressing what they need in the future. But I don't think things are so bad to say that data and information flow is going to seriously impede capability development in India in the future.
I share that view, actually. I think, in the day-to-day policy making, particularly in the context of a crisis, people understand the risks, what information blockages are. And out of sheer self-interest, right? You don't do this because you have some intellectual nobility. You do this out of sheer self-interest, that if information is not shared widely and effectively, you pay the costs, right?
Yeah.
And so that is something that I think that is what distinguishes a professional military in so many ways, right? That it's able to act on the facts as it sees them, without sort of gilding the facts. A couple of questions have come in from the floor, and I want to raise them.
But Ashley, can I just a very brief challenge on this? So I agree with you in large scope, right? But and I think all militaries do this. I'm not singling out India by any question, but when I looked at, say, the Punjab crisis, and I look at Kashmir, the institutionalization of lessons learned is, I think, really a challenge. And this speaks, and I'm not saying RTRAC or TRADOC is there's anything special about either of those institutions. But what I do see when I look at the Kashmir crisis and the Punjab crisis, there were a whole lot of lessons that Operation Blue Star should have suggested about how to handle some of the operations that were conducted on religious space in Kashmir. And when I've spoken to people about how it is that these lessons don't learn, well, they in some sense, there's an institutional story, the story that Arjun tells, right? There are all these different forces that are sent to deploy. They have their own institutional means of telling themselves what happened and why. And so there's a lot of soda straw based history, but there's no one institutionally capable of aggregating across those soda straws. And so in the day-to-day operations, as you said, Ashley, that's true. But when you think about the body of literature that you're drawing from, and you're in the heat of the moment trying to figure out, are we going to storm the Golden Temple? There may have been operational lessons from other things in the extensive history that India has had that would have informed that decision process differently.
Sure. Let me come back.
And I just want to butt in. And I think if you look at the fine print of every chapter that I write in the book, this is something that I've attempted to do. I've attempted to aggregate all these soda straws and come up with some kind of a set of lessons for future generations of military leaders. I'm going to say, for example, if you read my chapters on Kargil, I have tried to trod a less taken path in which I not only look at tactical and operational successes, but I look at leadership conundrums. I look at some of the failures. I look at some of the heartburn that has emerged after Kargil. In the sense, I don't think very many military historians or very many historians have been as critical of Sri Lanka of Operation Pavan as I have been. So I have actually tried my best to limit advocacy. And that is where, again, I have I have a small counter to what Jack Gill mentioned, is that that was one thing that I insisted on myself, and that is, this book is not going to be about advocacy. This book is going to be this book is going to be a story. It's going to be a narration of things as close to actual of what happened based on the available sources. So yes. Several lessons emerge in every chapter that I've written. So that soda straw issue is something that I was cognizant about from what Christine mentioned.
I'm conscious of the constraints of time here, but there are two questions that I think I want to have Arjun answer, which have come from the floor. One is a question that looks at the dissemination of language and cultural knowledge within the Indian military. And the specific example offered were Tamil-speaking officers posted to the IPKF when India deployed in Sri Lanka. That's a very specific question. And then the last question, which I will leave you with, is can you say something more about how you feel the Indian military has contributed to upholding democratic values in India? I think it's a particularly pertinent question in the context of India being a warring democracy. How has India's military actually contributed beyond the obvious to the sustenance of a democratic tradition? And we will end on that note, but I want to give you a chance, Arjun, to answer those. There are many other questions, by the way, that have come in, but we are not going to be able to entertain them simply for lack of time. Over to you.
Oh, yes. I think India's armed forces are one of the most culturally and linguistically tuned militaries in the world. And it's not often that you have soldiers drawn from over 50 communities forming part of operational forces. And let me give you an example that all intelligence operatives in Sri Lanka during Operation Pavan were Tamil-speaking officers. There was no distinction made on deploying the Madras Regiment into during Op Pavan into Sri Lanka, and there was no language problem, though there was a language problem in the sense that basically what the Indian Army did not do initially upfront was to ensure that every formation deployed in Sri Lanka had Tamil-speaking officers. That was not done. But to suggest that because the operation was being conducted in primarily Tamil-dominated territory, the Indian Army was skeptical about sending in Tamil officers because there would be there would be an issue with locals. That was not the case. Indian Tamil officers who were deployed with the IPKF were as committed to the task as anyone else. And similarly, in Operation Blue Star, the number of Sikh officers who were deployed in the operation demonstrated the osmosis that prevails within India's armed forces, that language and culture, rather than being divisive, are actually binding factors within the Indian military. So I think culturally and linguistically, India's armed forces have not faced any problem in operational areas. The second point that you
on democracy, the Indian military contribution to Indian democracy.
Yes. It's not only I mentioned it is plugging fissures and cracks. It is protecting democracy, geographical sovereignty and territorial frontiers, which is obviously a constitutional mandate. But the other way in which the Indian armed forces have enriched Indian democracy is in the manner in which they train, in the manner in which they interact with civil society during humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations, the manner in which they engage with civil society when law and order breaks down in different parts of the country. Several ways in which the Indian military has contributed to democracy in other ways than just military means. Let's look at the cultural diversity in the Indian armed forces, and the cultural diversity in India's armed forces have actually upheld all the traditions of its constitution in more ways than one. For example, I studied in a military school, and we celebrated every festival. There was an insistence that I knew more, that I knew as much about, say, a Hindu festival as a Sikh festival or a Christian festival, so that inclusivity within India's armed forces has rubbed off on Indian society also at large.
Well, thank you, Arjun. We could continue this conversation for at least another half an hour without a second thought. But I want to be respectful of both our audience's time and the time of all of you who have sort of spent this morning with me. And I want to thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to have this discussion about your book. I hope the book does well. I hope it stimulates an interest in military history and encourages others, in their own ways to go about enlarging the discipline. And I want to thank both Chris and Jack for, being very thoughtful, but also without sacrificing candor. So I really appreciate, your remarks this morning. And for our audience, thank you for staying with us. I think this will be permanently available on a YouTube channel at some point. For those of you who might want to sort of go back to it, to those who haven't had a chance to log in. But I want to wish all of you the best in these difficult times, and I hope we can see each other soon, in person, probably, hopefully, at the end of the summer. So thank you all very much, and take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Pleasure.